They thought they could trap me. They thought I would panic. They were wrong. At 6:42 a.m., I walked outside with my coffee. And froze. My driveway was blocked. Not by a car. Not by an accident. But by construction barriers. Bright orange cones. Steel fencing. Fresh concrete. And a sign. Access restricted by order of the HOA. I stared at it. My car was inside. Completely trapped. No warning. No letter. No vote. No permission. Just force. I pulled out my phone. Took pictures. Zoomed in on the concrete. Still wet. This wasn't temporary. This was intentional. 3 weeks earlier, the HOA had announced a community expansion project. They wanted to widen the shared access road. They said it would increase property values. They said it would help everyone. But they skipped one detail. The land they needed. It wasn't theirs. It belonged to someone else. And that someone had been very quiet. At 9:15 a.m., my phone rang. Karen. Of course. Her voice was sweet. Too sweet. Oh, it's temporary, she said. You can park on the street. For how long? I asked. A few weeks. Weeks. She said it casually. Like she owned my driveway. Like she owned my patience. I looked at the steel posts drilled into my concrete. This wasn't an adjustment. This was a takeover. They assumed I would argue. They assumed I would threaten lawyers. They assumed I would beg. They were wrong again. Because 3 days before this happened, I made a phone call. Not to complain. Not to warn them. But to prepare. I had already spoken to a real estate attorney. I had already pulled the property maps. I had already seen the boundary lines. And what I discovered was beautiful. The HOA didn't own the expansion strip. They never did. And the actual owner was tired of their pressure. Very tired. So when Karen blocked my driveway, she thought she was flexing power. What she really did was trigger a transaction. A legal one. A permanent one. They blocked my driveway. But they forgot something important. You can't control land you don't own. And by the end of this, they wouldn't just lose access. They would lose leverage. And they would lose it to me. Karen thought blocking my driveway would pressure me into compliance. What she didn't realize was that the moment those steel posts were drilled into concrete, she had crossed from petty enforcement into serious liability. And liability is expensive. 3 weeks earlier, when the HOA first presented their community expansion project, something about it felt rushed. They displayed glossy renderings and spoke about increased property values, smoother traffic flow, and shared benefit. But they avoided specifics. They never clearly identified the exact parcel of land they intended to use. That bothered me. So instead of arguing during the meeting like everyone expected, I stayed quiet. I went home and pulled the county property maps. What I found was simple but explosive: the narrow strip of land behind our homes, the very strip they needed to widen the access road, was not owned by the HOA. It belonged to a private owner. An elderly man who had inherited it decades ago and never sold. The HOA had been trying to pressure him quietly for months. Letters. Offers. Even subtle threats about community cooperation. He ignored them. When I called him, I didn't threaten. I didn't negotiate aggressively. I simply asked if he had plans for the land. He laughed. No one ever asks what I want, he said. We spoke for nearly an hour. He was tired of the HOA acting entitled. Tired of them assuming eventual surrender. He wasn't emotionally attached to the land, he was just unwilling to be pushed around. So I made an offer. Fair. Clean. Immediate. 3 days before Karen blocked my driveway, we signed a purchase agreement. The paperwork was already in motion. Which meant something very important. When the HOA installed that barrier across my driveway, they weren't just inconveniencing a homeowner. They were building on land that now had a new owner. Me. I didn't tell Karen that during our morning phone call. I let her speak confidently. I let her explain how this was for the greater good. I even thanked her for keeping me informed. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It's timing. By noon, my attorney had already sent a formal notice. Unauthorized construction. Trespassing. Interference with property access. And the best part? The concrete was still drying. They thought they were expanding their control. They didn't realize they had just funded my leverage. By 3:17 p.m., the HOA board members were no longer confident. They were confused. Then nervous. My attorney's formal notice had been delivered both by email and certified mail. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was cold, precise, and devastatingly clear. The land they were building on had changed ownership. Any further construction would constitute willful trespass. And the barriers blocking my driveway? Immediate removal required. I watched from my front window as Karen's SUV pulled up 30 minutes later. She stepped out quickly, clutching a folder, her expression tight and irritated. 2 other board members followed behind her, whispering. They walked straight to the back access strip. The same strip they proudly displayed in their expansion renderings. Only now it wasn't future HOA infrastructure. It was private property. Mine. I stepped outside calmly. Karen turned when she heard my footsteps. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the printed notice in the air. "It's accurate," I replied evenly. "You can't just," she started. "I already did." Silence hung between us. One of the other board members muttered, "Is this a joke?" I shook my head. "Check the county records." Karen's confidence began to crack. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly. I could almost see the exact moment the public database confirmed it. Ownership, transferred. Her face drained of color. "You bought it?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "For what reason?" I smiled slightly. "Investment." What I didn't say was the truth. I bought it because they assumed no one would. Because they assumed pressure would eventually force a sale. Because they assumed control was permanent. But control is fragile when it's built on assumptions. Karen turned toward the half-installed fencing and fresh concrete posts. "We already approved contractor payments," she said under her breath. "That sounds expensive," I replied. The weight of that reality began to settle on them. Contractors. Materials. Labor. Permits filed under inaccurate property claims. All of it now tied to land they did not own. Land they had altered without permission. Land that now belonged to someone who kept receipts. "You're going to remove the barriers," I said calmly. "Today." "And if we don't?" Karen asked, trying to recover authority. I held her gaze. "Then the next letter won't be from my attorney. It would be from the county. And possibly the sheriff." For the first time since this started, Karen wasn't speaking as HOA president. She was calculating damage. And the number wasn't small. Karen didn't leave that afternoon defeated. She left calculating. And when people like her start calculating, it usually means they're planning something reckless. By early evening, I received an email marked urgent board action. The tone had changed completely. Gone was the polite confusion. In its place was accusation. They claimed the land transfer was procedurally suspicious. They suggested I had interfered with an active community project. They hinted that I could be in violation of HOA cooperation clauses. It was intimidation dressed up as policy. What they didn't understand was that cooperation only applies to shared property. And this was no longer shared. My attorney responded within the hour. He attached the signed deed, the county confirmation, the timestamped transfer record. Then he added one sentence that made everything very simple. Any continued obstruction of my client's driveway will be interpreted as deliberate harassment and unlawful restriction of access. The word harassment changes conversations quickly. Around 7 p.m., a contractor truck pulled up near the barriers. I stepped outside again, curious. Two workers began examining the steel posts. Karen's SUV appeared minutes later. She stepped out and walked toward me with forced composure. "This is escalating unnecessarily," she said. "No," I replied calmly. "It's correcting itself." She lowered her voice. "You're embarrassing the board." I almost laughed at that. They blocked my driveway without notice. Installed concrete on land they didn't own. Attempted to pressure a private seller. And I was the embarrassment. "You had months to negotiate properly," I said. "You chose force instead." Her jaw tightened. "You could have talked to us." "I did," I reminded her. "You just didn't listen." Behind her, the contractors began loosening bolts. The scraping sound of metal against metal echoed in the evening air. Every turn of a wrench cost the HOA money. Labor reversal fees. Material removal. Concrete extraction. And that was before legal costs. Karen watched the workers carefully, as if hoping this was just a temporary setback. It wasn't. Because removing the barriers didn't solve their real problem. They still needed that land for their expansion. And now, the only person who could grant access was me. Power had shifted quietly. But completely. And Karen knew it. By the next morning, my driveway was clear. The steel fencing was gone. The cones had disappeared. Even the caution tape had been carefully removed. If someone had driven by, they would never have guessed what happened there less than 24 hours earlier. But the damage wasn't visible in concrete. It was visible in leverage. At 10:02 a.m., I received a new email from the HOA board. The subject line read, "Request for discussion." No accusations. No urgency. No threats. Just a request. I waited 3 hours before responding. Timing matters. When we finally met that afternoon in the clubhouse conference room, the atmosphere felt completely different from the expansion presentation weeks earlier. Back then, they had sat confidently at the front table, speaking as decision makers. Now they were careful. Measured. Karen folded her hands neatly in front of her. "We'd like to explore cooperative solutions," she began. Cooperative. Interesting choice of word. "You're still planning the road expansion," I said. "Yes," she admitted. "The community has already approved the budget." That meant contracts were signed. Deposits were paid. Plans were submitted. Canceling the project would cost them. Proceeding without my land would be impossible. They were cornered by their own ambition. "We're prepared to make a competitive offer for the strip," Karen continued. I leaned back slightly. "You already made offers to the previous owner." "That was before," she replied carefully. "Exactly. Before they assumed control. Before they blocked my driveway. Before they underestimated me." I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a formal proposal. Not just for the land value, but for easement terms, liability protections, construction limitations, written acknowledgement of unauthorized obstruction. Their legal advisor flipped through the pages slowly. "You're asking for oversight authority," he said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "If construction affects my property again, I approve modifications first." Karen inhaled sharply. You want veto power. I want protection. Silence settled across the room. They could reject it. But rejecting it meant redesigning the entire project. New engineering. New permits. New delays. Expensive delays. You planned this, Karen finally said. I met her eyes. No, I answered. I prepared. There's a difference. After a long pause, their attorney spoke quietly. This may be the most cost-effective path forward. Karen didn't look at me. She looked at the numbers in front of her. Because this wasn't about ego anymore. It was about math. And math doesn't care who started the fight. They didn't agree that day. But they didn't walk away either. That told me everything. Over the next week, emails moved back and forth between attorneys. The tone was professional, restrained, almost polite. But beneath every sentence was tension. The HOA had already invested heavily in the expansion. Engineering surveys. Contractor retainers. Permit applications. Even marketing materials highlighting the upgraded infrastructure in their next neighborhood newsletter. Pulling out now would expose mismanagement. Proceeding without my approval would expose liability. They were trapped between pride and paperwork. Midweek, I received an unexpected knock at my door. Not Karen. Not a board member. But two homeowners from the neighborhood. They looked uneasy. We heard you bought the strip, one of them said quietly. News travels fast in HOA communities. Yes, I confirmed. They exchanged a glance before continuing. They raised next quarter's dues to cover unexpected project adjustments. There it was. The hidden consequence. When the board makes mistakes, the community pays. Literally. I hadn't asked for their support, but it was forming anyway. People were tired of sudden decisions and vague justifications. Blocking my driveway had crossed a visible line. Increasing dues crossed a financial one. That evening, Karen sent another email requesting a final negotiation meeting. The subject line was shorter this time. Settlement discussion. When we sat down again, the atmosphere felt heavier. Their attorney spoke first. We are prepared to accept your oversight condition. Karen's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. In addition, he continued, the board agrees to compensate you for the temporary obstruction of your driveway. Compensate. An interesting evolution from temporary inconvenience. The amount they offered wasn't insignificant. But it wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement. I reviewed the revised agreement carefully. The language was tighter now. Clear boundaries. Construction timelines. Financial penalties for violation. No assumptions. No ambiguity. Just terms. You understand, Karen said quietly, that this changes how future projects will be handled. Yes, I replied. That's the point. Control without accountability creates arrogance. Accountability creates caution. After a long pause, she extended her hand across the table. I shook it. Not as an enemy. Not as a friend. But as the new gatekeeper of the land they needed. And this time, everything would be done properly. Because mistakes are expensive. But arrogance. Even more. Cost's real turning point didn't happen in a lawyer's office. It happened at the next HOA community meeting. The room was full. More full than usual. Word had spread about the driveway incident. About the land purchase. About the dues increase. People who normally skipped meetings were suddenly very interested in governance. Karen stood at the front with the rest of the board, composed but noticeably less confident than before. The expansion project was on the agenda again, this time under revised development plan. When they opened the floor for questions, hands went up immediately. Why were barriers installed without notice? Why did dues increase? who approved construction before verifying ownership. The questions weren't angry. They were precise. That's more dangerous. Karen attempted to frame it as a misunderstanding. A timing issue. An administrative oversight. But documentation doesn't bend easily. Several homeowners had printed copies of county property records. Others referenced the formal notice that had circulated quietly after my attorney filed it. Transparency has momentum once it starts. Eventually, someone asked directly, "Is it true the land now belongs to a homeowner?" Karen hesitated. "Yes," she said carefully. "But we've reached a cooperative agreement." That word again. Cooperative. All eyes shifted toward me. I hadn't planned to speak. But silence sometimes implies weakness. So I stood. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't attack the board. I simply explained the sequence of events calmly: the expansion announcement, the unclear property ownership, the purchase, the obstruction, and the final agreement with oversight protections. No embellishment. Just facts. The room grew very quiet. Because facts are heavier than accusations. One homeowner asked, "So the project only continues because you allowed it?" I paused briefly before answering. The project continues because proper agreements were signed. Which was true. But everyone understood what it meant. The board no longer had unchecked authority. They had conditions. And conditions require discipline. By the end of the meeting, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't applause. It wasn't confrontation. It was awareness. The board members walked out differently that night. Less dominant. More cautious. They had learned that power isn't permanent just because it's printed on a title. And as for me, I had learned something too. When you prepare quietly, you don't need to raise your voice later. You just need patience. Construction resumed 2 weeks later. This time, everything was different. Before a single machine rolled onto the strip, I received detailed schedules. Engineering adjustments were sent to me for written approval. Temporary access paths were mapped carefully to avoid interference with my property. No surprise barriers. No fresh concrete poured overnight. No assumptions. The contractors were polite. Almost cautious. One of them even joked quietly, "Guess we triple-check ownership now." Good. That's how it should have been from the beginning. The HOA newsletter came out at the end of the month. The expansion project was described as a collaborative effort between the board and a property stakeholder. Property stakeholder. A far cry from temporary inconvenience. Neighbors began stopping me during evening walks. Not to gossip, but to ask questions. How did you know to check the land records? Was it expensive to buy? Did they really block your driveway without notice? People weren't just curious about the story. They were curious about the lesson. Because for years, the board had operated with minimal pushback. Small fines here. Landscaping citations there. Policy adjustments introduced quietly. Nothing dramatic. Just steady, unquestioned authority. Until it wasn't unquestioned anymore. One afternoon, I noticed something subtle but important. The HOA posted draft proposals online before voting on them. That had never happened before. They invited written feedback. They clarified property boundaries in future documents. Transparency wasn't advertised. But it was happening. Not because they wanted to appear generous. But because risk had become real. The expansion was eventually completed. The road was wider. Traffic flowed smoothly. Property values likely did increase. And I signed off on every construction milestone exactly as agreed. I didn't interfere unnecessarily. I didn't delay progress. Because this was never about sabotage. It was about balance. Karen and I crossed paths occasionally after that. Our conversations were civil. Measured. No warmth, but no hostility either. She had learned something too. Authority works best when it's earned, not imposed. Months later, standing at the edge of that widened road, I realized something ironic. They had wanted more control over the neighborhood. Instead, they had created accountability. They tried to block my driveway. But what they really did was open a door. Looking back, the strangest part of all of this is how unnecessary it was. If Karen had knocked on my door before installing those barriers, if the board had verified the land ownership before approving contractors, if they had approached negotiation with humility instead of assumption, none of it would have escalated. But arrogance has a way of accelerating mistakes. The driveway incident became something bigger than a blocked entrance. It became a story that circulated quietly through the neighborhood and even beyond it. Nearby communities heard about it. Other HOA boards took notice. Because the lesson was simple. Power without paperwork is fragile. Months passed. The expansion was complete. The widened access road blended naturally into the neighborhood, as if it had always been there. Most people eventually stopped talking about the conflict. But the structure of decision-making had changed. Board proposals now included verified property maps. Legal confirmations were reviewed before contractor deposits were issued. Public notices were sent before any physical changes were made. The board hadn't lost authority. They had lost assumption. And that made all the difference. One evening, Karen approached me during a community gathering. The tension that once defined our conversations was gone. What remained was something quieter. "You made your point," she said. "I didn't try to," I replied. She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You forced us to slow down." "Good," I said. "Big decisions should move slowly." There was no apology. None was needed. The outcome spoke for itself. What began as a blocked driveway ended as a reset of power dynamics. The land I purchased remained technically mine, though the HOA now held a formal, conditional easement under the agreement we negotiated. Everything documented. Everything clear. Everything earned. The irony still makes me smile sometimes. They blocked my driveway to assert control. Instead, they financed their own lesson.
Because when they tried to corner me, I didn't agree. I prepared, and preparation doesn't short. It waits. So if there one thing that's taught me it this when someone blocks your path, don't just push back. Check on the ground first. Sometimes the smartest move isn't fighting harder; it's owning the land they forget to secure, and they should have just asked.